It's a chase and race sensation. It's Segaiden Episode 7. My original plan for Segaiden was to cover 4 SG-1000 cartridges per week. But when the games are as strong as they are in this episode, it seems unfair to give them short shrift by crowding them in with a bunch of other lesser games. So, this episode, we're going to look at 2 strong arcade conversions. We begin with Sindbad Mystery, a game that originally debuted on Sega's G80 arcade hardware. As a platform, the G80's capabilities fell somewhere between the VIC Dual system, where the first 3 SG-1000 games originated from, and the Sega System 1, where Starjacker came from. As such, this conversion is a pretty satisfying but not entirely arcade-accurate conversion.
Sindbad Mystery is notable for being the first proper maze chase game for SG-1000. At this point in the console's library, I assume we're in the latter days of 1983, and that means Pac-Man and its derivatives still had a lot of traction in arcades. With Sindbad Mystery, Sega embarked on its own chase for Maze Craze fame. Sega Retro credits the game's design to Steve Hanawa and Yoshiki Kawasaki, 2 men who had a hand in quite a few of Sega's arcade and console titles during the early 80s. This is another of their solid efforts. As you'd expect from a Sega original, Sindbad Mystery's creators weren't content to simply mimic someone else's hit game. They added their own flair to it, combining a variety of different mechanics into an action game that feels distinct enough to stand apart. There's a very vague Arabian Nights theme here, which mostly manifests in the form of the player's sprite, the anonymous Sindbad, and the fact that your task in each stage has you searching for a hidden magic lamp. This being a Pac-Man derivative, of course, there's plenty of territory to be controlled. In this case, the territory control concept is made quite literal, in that you collect question marks as you traverse the stage, which combine to create a treasure map of the stage in the scorebar to the right of the screen. While this wasn't the first game to include a mini-map like this, see also Defender, Rally X, BOSCONIAN, etc., this might be the first case of a game where you assemble a miniature replica of the stage itself. Once the minimap has been completed, the lost lamp materializes, and so does an evil skull. Naturally, you need to collect the lamp before the skull collects you, which is more easily said than done given that the skull typically spawns close to the lamp's location and makes a beeline for Sindbad. The skull is not the only threat you need to evade here, naturally. In order to gather up all the map pieces, you need to evade a motley assortment of foes that roam the stages. These include what appear to be bears, lizards, and undead warriors, which I feel are almost definitely meant as a reference to Ray Harryhausen's classic Sinbad movies. The standard monsters here are neither particularly aggressive nor especially smart, so they're pretty easy to evade. The greatest hazard here really comes from allowing yourself to become trapped by them as they wander aimlessly. And you do have a few defenses against them. These include the traditional maze game warps at the edge of the screen, as well as some tunnels within each stage that serve the same function by allowing you to jump from one portion of the screen immediately to another. The tunnels are integrated into one of Sindbad Mystery's more distinguishing features, its elevation. Rather than playing out as a simple maze chase, Sindbad Mystery introduces a hint of the third dimension here by setting the action across 2 levels, high and low. With the isometric stage graphics, the visuals call to mind Crystal Castles, but the point of the warp tunnels is that there's less need to spend time with your character and his foes obscured by raised stage elements. For the most part, the raised portions simply work as an extension of the bottom level of the maze, with short ramps connecting them and warp tunnels running beneath. Some stages do add a little more complexity by creating a more elaborate upper level lattice that runs above portions of the ground floor, but for the most part this is less complex than something like Crush Roller, which it strongly resembles. The real value of the raised ground is that it gives the player a means of self-defense. Each stage contains a boulder that can be pushed around by Sindbad. Roll the boulder over a bad guy and you'll briefly take it out of the action. If you push a boulder from the top edge of a ramp, it will roll freely downhill and crush all the monsters in its path, which always feels like a great accomplishment. It's possible for the boulder to become cornered and cover up a critical map icon, but there's enough nuance to the controls here that you can actually roll the ball laterally rather than only straight ahead. Take that, Sokoban. The boulder can even give you some breathing room against the skull, though it's not infallible. If you don't have enough momentum as you roll the boulder, an enemy can pass through it and kill poor Sindbad. On top of that, Sindbad Mystery even arcs back to the oldest and most venerable of maze chase games, Heiankyo Alien. That's right, as monsters chase you around, you can dig holes in the ground to buy yourself a moment of respite. While this mechanic is very clearly derived from Heiankyo Alien, it's not as useful here. So far as I can tell, monsters don't appear to be susceptible to the pits, even if you dig directly beneath their feet. The enemy critters are also pretty skilled at filling in the holes and marching straight ahead as if nothing ever happened. At best, digging is just a way to potentially, though not necessarily, deter a pursuing monster and cause it to change direction as it closes in on you. So basically, Sindbad Mystery draws influence from a whole lot of contemporary arcade and computer hits. Pac-Man, Crush Roller, Heiankyo Alien, Sokoban, or maybe Indiana Jones, and possibly even Lock and Chase and Crystal Castles. About it all it's missing is some Space Invader style shooting, really. But Sega did some great work here, and derivative as Sindbad Mystery's individual components may be, the final product is more than the sum of its parts. It's a fun and highly playable entry in the arcade maze genre, and while the SG-1000 version suffers a bit from reduced graphics and that mushy SJ-200 joystick, it still would have made a compelling home gaming purchase in 1983.
Even more impressive, however, is Sindbad Mystery's immediate follow-up on the SG-1000, Monaco GP. Like Sindbad Mystery, Monaco GP hailed from the arcades, but unlike Sindbad Mystery, it was actually a pretty big hit.
You could even argue that the 1979 coin-op release of Monaco GP was the game that put Sega on the radar as an arcade force to be reckoned with. Plus, it paved the way for the even bigger success Turbo and its world-class follow-up Outrun. Monaco GP is also a notable historic footnote for being the final major arcade release to run on its own dedicated transistor-based board rather than on a standardized platform like VicDual or G80. Unsurprisingly, it holds enough esteem within Sega to have received a 3D remake for PlayStation 2 20 years after this one, the original home version of the game. The company seems to have put a lot of stock into this old version, though.
Monaco GP would be one of the few games converted from cartridge to the MyCard format when the SG-1000 Mark II launched in 1984. Sega also produced a special racing controller for the SG-1000, the SH-400, which shipped around the same time as the Mark II and was heavily marketed around Monaco GP as well as Safari Race.
It's not hard to see why Sega put its chips on this game. It's a strong conversion. Given the archaic architecture of the arcade cabinet, the SG-1000 does a pretty convincing job of recreating the experience at home. This version is neither as fast nor as colorful as the coin-op, but it's an impressive adaptation all the same. As I've mentioned before, the SG-1000 hardware lacked built-in support for smooth scrolling, a feature that would prove to be a major advantage for Nintendo's Famicom. But Monaco GP moves at such a speedy clip that you don't really notice the slight choppiness of the background while you play. It only really becomes noticeable when you slow way down, at which point you're not going to be playing that long because your car will be smashed up by oncoming traffic. Based on research by the Game Developer Research Institute, it appears as though the SG-1000 conversion of the game was handled internally at Sega by future Arc System Works president Minoru Kidoka, so maybe its visual panache shouldn't come as a surprise. All in all, it's a very capable conversion of the arcade game. Monaco GP puts you in control of a race car making its way across, I guess, Monaco. The landscapes here are quite varied for a racer of this vintage, shifting from cityscapes to bridges over rivers to pitch-black tunnels to what appear to be slippery ice patches. A sign of climate change at work in this scorching hot equatorial nation, no doubt. You accelerate by pressing up or down on the joystick, steer right and left with the stick, and jump with the controller buttons. This maps pretty neatly onto the SH-400 controller, where the wheel steers your car laterally, and the gear shift selector basically adjusts your speed by set increments. The basic controllers provide a smoother, more video game-like experience, but the handle controller really does manage to convey an impressive sense of racing a car. Here you see an interesting contrast to Nintendo's Famicom, which in its decade-plus of existence never received any kind of steering wheel peripheral in any region. Well, except Varier's ridiculous Top Rider inflatable motorcycle, which isn't really quite the same thing. Meanwhile, Sega focused in on bringing arcade experiences to its consoles right from the start here. The SH-400 would be forward compatible on into the Master System era. At the same time, Sega was savvy to the specific needs of the home market. You can see that at work in Monaco GP on SG-1000, which tweaks the arcade game's design in small ways. The coin-op used a vertical screen with a separate LED score display to the right of the CRT, which of course was impossible to do on SG-1000, so the entire thing is compacted down into a single display. This allows the main game display to maintain the impression of a vertical orientation, though obviously with less resolution. Monaco GP runs a little more slowly on SG-1000, allowing players enough time to react to oncoming hazards, even with their forward view truncated. As was typical with many older racers, you're not competing for placement against a set of specific competitors, just going for time and mileage and distance and score against an endless array of generic cars. Those other racers mostly exist as a road hazard. The slightest collision sends you spinning out of control, and they function as a gauge for how fast you're driving. The faster you drive, the faster you come up on other racers, and therefore the less time you have to dodge them. Drive too slowly, and your car falls back down toward the bottom of the screen, leaving you vulnerable to racers approaching from behind. Occasionally, an ambulance will streak past from behind. A massive emergency vehicle, somehow capable of driving even faster than Formula One cars, impressively enough. Bridges are tricky since you basically need to match speeds with other cars to avoid being run off into the water. And tunnels are even more dangerous, as you're the only driver with enough brains to use your headlights. This means other cars lurk in the darkness, unseen, just waiting to smash into you and send you careening into the walls. So Monaco GP becomes a test of balance, finding the sweet spot between top speed and first gear, where you can most effectively avoid other cars and maneuver around other features of the road. Speaking of features of the road, the home conversion of Monaco GP drops one defining element of the arcade version: the pulsating roadside. Based on all off-screen footage I found of Monaco GP cabinets, bear in mind I've never seen the arcade game in person, and its TTL board took years to be properly emulated, the game simulated the sensation of a narrowing and widening roadway, not by creating a clearly defined racetrack, but rather by simply causing the sides of the road to throb in and out. While this gets the point across while you're racing at top speeds, it is a sort of strange effect in hindsight. Anyway, the SG-1000 hardware lacked the oomph to make its scenery move in ripples like that. So instead, this port simply lays down a more traditional track whose narrow spaces and branches are clearly predetermined, built into the structure of the road. It also provides small road hazard icons to warn players of impending changes, including sharp barriers on the left or right side of the road, bridges, and even gaps that need to be leapt with the action buttons. The console port gives players a choice of 3 difficulty settings, which just determines the number of rival cars that can appear on screen at once, 1, 2, or 3. And unlike the arcade release, where you had infinite cars until a 90-second timer ran out, after which a single collision would cause a game over wipeout, here you just have 3 cars. Altogether, it's a really fantastic racer for a console of this vintage. You can once again see how hard Sega went with the SG-1000 from the outset, compared to Nintendo and Famicom, which countered this white-knuckled coin-op conversion with, Donkey Kong Jr. math?
Nintendo wouldn't have anything comparable to Monaco GP until the end of 1984, when F1 Race launched. The SG-1000 may not have had graphical capabilities on par with the Famicom, but Sega front-loaded the system's library with lots of strong, great contenders. And even once the SG-1000 faded away, Sega would continue building on the Monaco GP legacy. In fact, in a way, they still are. Next time on Segaiden, believe it or not, more arcade conversions.